You know what's frustrating? A lot of people study English for years. Like, years. They learn grammar, understand lessons, and can read pretty well. But then they watch a movie or hear native speakers talking naturally, and suddenly everything feels impossible again. Everything sounds too fast. So your brain starts to panic, and you end up turning the subtitles back on just to feel safe again. And honestly, if that sounds familiar, this episode is for you. Welcome to the English Story Lab. I'm Clara. This is our very first podcast episode. And who better to have here than the voice behind the channel? Adrian is the one behind the stories, the explanations, the vocabulary breakdowns. You've probably heard his voice a few times already. But today he's here with me, and we're just going to have a really honest conversation about something a lot of English learners struggle with.
Which still feels strange, honestly. I'm used to talking through the stories, not actually sitting here having a conversation with someone. And you know me. I'm pretty introverted, so I usually prefer staying behind the scenes.
Well, looks like you're stuck with me today.
Fair enough, let's do it.
Because I think this is something almost every English learner struggles with, but not many people talk about openly. Not understanding real spoken English can feel kind of embarrassing sometimes, especially when you've been studying for years.
Yes, because people think, I can read English, I can study English, I can even understand lessons. So why does real listening still feel impossible without subtitles? And that frustration becomes emotional really quickly.
Yeah, a lot of learners become deeply frustrated by it. Like they're somehow failing while everyone else seems to understand naturally.
When in reality, they're usually much closer than they think.
So, let's start with the big question. Why does this happen? Why can someone understand subtitles perfectly, but completely lose comprehension when the subtitles disappear?
Because reading and listening are not the same skill, and subtitles can quietly replace listening without you noticing.
Even English subtitles?
Especially English subtitles, honestly. Because when subtitles are on, your brain naturally takes the easier path. It reads, the eyes start doing most of the work, and the ears slowly stop participating as much.
So the comprehension is real, but it's coming more from reading than listening.
And the thing is, it feels exactly the same. Like, you finish the video, you got everything, you feel good about it, but your listening didn't actually improve at all, because you weren't really listening.
The listening muscle?
Yeah, exactly.
I really like that expression, actually, because it does feel like a muscle. If you don't really use it, it just doesn't grow.
And it's kind of similar to going to the gym for the first time. Everything feels uncomfortable. Your body gets tired really fast. And trust me, I know that from personal experience.
Okay, that's fair.
And listening works pretty much the same way. You're not going to understand every word, and sometimes you'll lose entire sentences. But you kind of have to make peace with that feeling, just like at the gym when everything feels difficult at first. The brain naturally wants the easiest and most comfortable path, so it really doesn't like uncertainty. But ironically, that's exactly where a lot of real progress happens.
And I think that's why most learners panic the second they don't catch something.
Yes, the brain immediately reacts like, something is wrong, I'm lost, and subtitles fix that discomfort instantly, so they become really hard to let go of. It's not laziness or anything like that. Subtitles just feel safe.
And safety is hard to give up. Trust me, I stay in my comfort zone way more than I should.
Yeah, the brain likes familiarity, so it becomes a cycle, right? Subtitles feel safe, so you use them. And because you keep using them, listening never really develops. And because listening never develops, you need the subtitles.
And what people don't talk about is how exhausting that gets over time. You start avoiding movies, real conversations, podcasts, all of it. Because every listening experience starts feeling like proof that your English still isn't good enough.
When most of the time, the opposite is true. A lot of learners are understanding way more than they realize. But panic kind of takes over the whole experience, so the brain focuses on everything it missed instead of everything it understood.
That's such an important point.
Because even when listening feels messy, your brain is already picking up on stuff like the rhythm, the emotion, the context, and familiar words. You're already starting to feel meaning before you fully understand every sentence.
And I think that's comforting to hear, because most learners assume if I missed words, I understood nothing.
But listening doesn't really work like that. Even in your native language, you don't consciously process every single word. A lot of comprehension is instinctive. You feel the meaning first, and then the brain fills in the gaps afterward. And honestly, that's where real listening starts becoming more natural.
And that's basically the foundation of this whole channel. So, Adrian, can you explain the method a little more? Because I think a lot of people watch the stories without realizing how intentional the structure actually is.
Sure, everything starts with the first listen without subtitles. And I want to make something really clear here. The point isn't to make things harder just for the sake of it. It's actually the opposite. The goal is to finally train the part of listening that subtitles usually replace.
And that's why the stories come before any explanation.
Right, because on that first listen, your brain has no choice but to actually listen. There's no text to fall back on. So instead, your brain starts paying attention to other things to try to understand, like the rhythm, the emotion, the tone, and the atmosphere. And that's intentional. The stories are written that way specifically, to be felt before they're fully understood.
I love that phrase, felt before understood, because that's kind of what real communication feels like sometimes, isn't it?
Especially with native speakers. People interrupt each other, change direction in the middle of a sentence, mumble words, speak emotionally. Real speech is messy sometimes.
And learners usually think that if they can't follow all of it perfectly, they're bad at English.
When in reality, that's just how listening works. It's not like solving a math equation where every piece has to be perfectly clear before meaning appears. A lot of listening is instinctive.
By the way, that connects really well to last week's story.
Yeah, it does. The whole story was built around cosmic horror, the fear of confronting something the human mind can't fully process. And weirdly enough, listening in another language can trigger a similar feeling sometimes, especially without subtitles.
It sounds dramatic at first, but I kind of get what you mean.
Because when you're listening without subtitles, there is this constant feeling of uncertainty. Like, you're trying to follow what's being said, you're concentrating, and then suddenly you realize you missed an entire sentence.
And your brain immediately starts spiraling.
Exactly. And after a while, that becomes mentally exhausting. You start wondering if all the effort is even doing anything.
Especially when you've already spent years studying.
Yeah, and that's also why I don't think passive exposure alone is enough for most learners. Watching random shows for hours helps a little, sure. But a lot of people already do that and still feel stuck with listening.
Because they're hearing English, but not really processing it actively.
That's the key difference. The structure here is meant to guide your attention while you're listening, instead of just throwing language at you. The stories are slower, clearer, and emotionally easier to follow. Then later, the vocabulary and grammar return inside a context your brain already recognizes emotionally. So, instead of feeling random, things start connecting naturally over time.
So the goal isn't immediate perfection.
Not even close. The goal is becoming more comfortable with uncertainty, because once the panic gets smaller, listening starts feeling much more manageable, and eventually, things that once sounded impossible start sounding normal.
Which connects perfectly to that line from the story, actually.
Yeah, the human mind is still a primitive tool, incapable of holding what exists beyond the veil. Cosmic horror is basically built around the fear of confronting something too vast to fully understand. And listening without subtitles can feel exactly like that for a lot of people. The brain just interprets that uncertainty almost like a threat.
That's actually such an interesting comparison. Because the discomfort inside the story kind of mirrors the discomfort of learning itself.
And that's why atmosphere matters so much in language learning too. Sometimes you understand the feeling before you fully understand the sentence. And that emotional understanding becomes a bridge into real comprehension later.
And then after the first listen, that's when vocabulary and grammar come in.
Right, but now the words already have emotional memory attached to them. A word like creeping or whimper from last week's story doesn't feel like isolated vocabulary anymore. You already heard those words inside a tense moment first.
Which feels very different from memorizing random vocabulary lists.
A lot different. And grammar stops feeling so mechanical, too. Instead of just thinking, oh, this is passive voice, you start thinking, why did this sentence feel tense? Why did this structure create discomfort? So, language stops feeling like a school subject and starts feeling more expressive and emotional. Then the second listen happens, this time with subtitles. And that's usually the moment people suddenly realize, wait, I actually understood more than I thought. And psychologically, that moment matters a lot. Because step by step, confidence starts replacing panic.
You know what I find interesting? A lot of learners think the uncomfortable feeling means they're doing something wrong. Like if listening feels difficult, confusing, or exhausting, then maybe they're just not good at languages.
Yeah, most of the time that feeling is just part of the process. I think people underestimate how emotionally intense listening can be sometimes, especially in another language. Because when you stop understanding for a few seconds, the brain reacts immediately. You feel disconnected from the conversation, and then you resort to subtitles to feel in control again.
And the scary part is how fast that feeling appears.
Sometimes it only takes one missed sentence. Suddenly you're trying to figure out what you missed, and while you're doing that, the conversation keeps moving.
That's why people cling to subtitles so hard.
Subtitles remove uncertainty instantly. They make the brain feel grounded again. But at the same time, if you never experience that discomfort, your listening never really adapts to real speech either.
So part of improving listening is learning not to panic, even when things become unclear for a moment.
Yeah, because uncertainty itself isn't the problem. Panic is usually the real problem.
That's such an important distinction.
I think that's why the line from the story resonated with so many people. The human mind is still a primitive tool, because the brain really does resist uncertainty. It wants clarity and control immediately. But language doesn't work that way. Real conversations are messy. Even native speakers misunderstand things sometimes. I mean, even in your native language, sometimes you hear a line in a movie and go, wait, what did they say?
I think learners forget that. They imagine native speakers understand every word perfectly, all the time.
But understanding language doesn't really work like that. A lot of listening is just catching enough, staying relaxed, and letting meaning build gradually. Not translating every sentence perfectly in real time.
And I think that's also why your stories work so well for listening practice. Because they slow people down emotionally.
The idea is to make listening feel less stressful and more immersive. To make people stop treating listening like a test and start experiencing English more naturally.
Well, this was really fun. Thanks for being here, Adrian.
Thanks for inviting me. I was a little nervous at first, but this ended up feeling surprisingly natural.
See, you survived.
Somehow, yeah.
So just a quick reminder before we go. Every other week, there's a new story here on the channel. And in between the stories, we're going to keep having conversations like this too. Not just about English, but about the ideas, emotions, and experiences that sometimes come with learning, stories, and life in general.
And if listening has ever made you feel frustrated or exhausted, you're probably doing better than you think you are. Learning to understand real speech takes time, especially when your brain is still getting used to uncertainty.
And if you haven't watched last week's story yet, maybe give it a try without turning the subtitles on right away.
Try staying with the discomfort a little longer than usual. Then come back after the explanations and listen again. That second listen can feel very different.
And we'll see you in the next conversation.